up, everybody? It's Andy Bassett here with an encore education update. So right now, a pretty pertinent topic, something top of mind to everybody, obviously, is COVID-19. And so we've been doing, as we're always doing, a lot of analysis in the market and thinking through the risk factors that could impact businesses specifically with COVID-19. And so one thing we've been studying and has kind of come to mind is the legal environment, the liability, litigation around COVID-19. And so we started to dig into it and really want to understand, because we know to this point, if we're business owners, many of us, restaurants, hospitality, retail, you name it, have been significantly impacted by COVID-19, specifically to losing income, with some of the shutdowns and the mandatory policies and procedures that have been put in place, by our government. And so we've battled through that. A lot of our clients and businesses out there have realized insurance, unfortunately, wasn't a solution for that. So we're working through that, and there has been some assistance through the government funding and things. But now we're kind of looking forward, like what may come yet. And that's where we started to shift to this whole idea around liability specific to COVID-19, and specifically diving into that. When you think about the diseases of ordinary life, historically, it's been not common to think that as a business owner, I'm potentially at risk to getting sued by somebody that thinks they contracted the cold or flu or whatever it may be because of my business or being at my facility or whatever the case is. And so, but we started unpacking a little bit how COVID-19 might shift that thinking. And so there's certainly a possibility that we could see a little bit of a ramp up maybe in the opportunity for litigation and things of that nature. So when we started to dive into it and really want to understand it, there's some things we want people to understand and realize when you think of liability and you think of specifically insurance. So first and foremost, when we think about liability for things like bodily injury to third parties and property damage, we naturally think of the general liability policy. And so when we start looking through that, there are some things specific to what I'm talking about with COVID liability that can come into play. Many of those policies have or may have in the future what's called a communicable disease exclusion, which is basically saying, look, if you're sued or somebody's potentially trying to find that you're negligent for the transmission of one of the diseases of ordinary life, like COVID, in and out of the course of employment, the policy may not respond. And so we're encouraging everybody to understand that our team is going very thoroughly through all the policies we have to see, but the reality is very many of them already had that on them or are adding it. So the insurance industry, unfortunately, at this point doesn't, certainly from a broad brush perspective, does not look to be like a great solution for managing that risk. So then we started looking and thinking, where else can it come? Where else can protection exist? And we started looking at, to our legislators, to our government bodies. Can there be some assistance there? And when you dive into it, there has been an attempt at the federal level to try to address this. And specifically through some legislation that's been drafted. It has not gotten very far, unfortunately, nor do we anticipate it probably will. But the idea behind it was basically around tort reform, tort litigation reform. And for those of you that don't understand tort, my interpretation of tort, and some attorneys may comment or correct on this, but basically tort is civil law. It's anything other than criminal litigation. So when you think of things about liability, you think of the tort legal system. Tort reform historically has been a pretty tough thing to have happen in our industry or in the United States. And so we don't see a lot of reform or limitation to tort law over time. The big thing with tort litigation is that in order for tort law to be brought and successfully potentially achieved is we just have to prove some form of negligence on the party that we're on the defendant. And so where tort reform has always come into play is to try to adjust that or limit that. And so what has happened in recent legislation was the law or the legislation was drafted to say, all right, we're not going to sit here and try and completely reform tort litigation or tort law, but for a 5-year period where there was going to be a moratorium around the ability for tort litigation to be brought and successfully achieved in tort law around COVID unless gross negligence could be proven. And that's a big deal because what our perspective was is maybe it keeps some of this frivolous stuff from developing where people get together and try to bring maybe class action type litigation around COVID-related claims and things of that nature, just on the hopes of getting a settlement, because the defense is going to say, well, we could be found to be somewhat negligent or negligent in some capacity for this contraction of COVID. So the way that we understood the legislation is it seemed very favorable for businesses, but I'm going to say it doesn't appear to have a lot of legs at this point. Last thing, and kind of in closing, is we then went further and started reaching out at the more state level. That was federal legislation. So we've contacted and started reaching out to some of our legislators at the state level to say, hey, is there anything that's going to happen? At this point, there's no indication that it will. We're seeing some things in certain states. In the state of Nebraska, nothing's happening at this point that I'm aware of. However, it is top of mind, it's being thought about, and hopefully something will come that can help protect us as business owners. So we want everybody to understand that. We want you to ask questions. We want you to reach out to either us or your advisors and really understand if this litigation would start to come, are you protected? If not, how can you protect yourselves? So at that, think about it. Hopefully you learned something, and we're here to help. Take care.